Speaking with George Grande, Cincinnati Reds broadcaster and former MC of the Baseball Hall of Fame. I met George Grande years ago. I was covering the New York Mets. It was opening day in Cincinnati, and I can't imagine you'd remember the conversation, but I felt a bond with George Grande because I think he's the only other person that said, growing up, we couldn't wait for it to get dark so that we could listen to baseball games on 50,000-watt AM radio stations. If you can possibly remember that conversation, I'll be amazed. But it was a link, and I said, this guy's okay. This guy's one of us and all that. You won't find someone who has more enthusiasm for baseball, and certainly that's how he got to be the top baseball reporter at ESPN for many years, and then be the MC at the Hall of Fame. I'll ask you, the weekend in Cooperstown, I've been there. It's a magical event out in the country. I think a lot of our local listeners in East Tennessee can appreciate going out in the country, but just memories of Cooperstown. What's it like for someone who hasn't been to the Hall of Fame induction ceremonies?
You hit the nail on the head, Marky. And yeah, I do remember that conversation because, we all grew up back in those days. There was only the NBC game was on Saturday, but that was the only national TV game that you found. And I grew up in the New York area, and in New York, you had the pick of who you wanted to get. There was this big mountain near where I lived. I go up. I had a transistor radio that I'd listen to at home, and then as I got older and I could drive a car, I went up to this big mountain with my car radio, and I'd be listening to, you listen in New York, obviously, where, Mel Allen and Red Barber were doing the games. And even when the Giants moved, Les Kiter used to recreate the Giants game, and I learned a lot from him over the years. Chuck Thompson was down in Baltimore. Harry Carey was in St. Louis. You go down the list, every place you went. I could get Ernie Harwell because it was a 50,000-watt stadium station in Detroit. So, and from Boston, Ken Coleman, and, go down the list. A lot of great broadcasters, a lot of great people that you'd listen to. And, we all had a dream. I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. I went to the University of Southern California, played for Rod Dedeaux, and in '68, we won the national championship. And I learned a lot being there. Number one was that I wasn't good enough to be a Major League Baseball player, but number two, Rod introduced me to Vin Scully, and I was a gopher for Vin for 4 years while I was at USC playing baseball. I'd clean out the booth for him and rip the wires and get him coffee. And so we all had that dream. And I think all of those dreams really wind up in a confluence of love for the game when you get to Cooperstown. Whether you were from Tennessee or Connecticut or California, I'd always, in our years, I started going to Cooperstown in the 70s when Bill Guilfoyle was the director of information, and I would cover it in radio. And then when I went to ESPN for 30 years, I emceed the ceremonies. And every year, right before the ceremonies, I'd walk out, into the crowd where there'd be anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people, depending on who was getting in that year. And there were fans from all over the country, all over the world that brought pictures or memorabilia from their favorite players. Some of them might be inducted on those days, but other ones were, just fans of people that followed some of the Hall of Famers who'd return. So it's pretty special. You walk down Main Street in Cooperstown, and you get fans from every walk of life, and the one unifying factor is that we all love the game. And I think there's such a happy feeling as everybody smiles in Cooperstown if you're a baseball fan, and especially on this weekend. I just talked to Jeff Bagwell this morning, as a matter of fact, up there, and I followed Jeff from when he was a high school soccer and baseball player in Connecticut, and I told him, I said, Bags, enjoy it, but just get through this year, because the year that you're getting in is crazy. They're taking you here, taking you there, and then the next year you can hide in the weeds and enjoy it. So he says, I'm looking forward to next year already. So that's the way it is.
Well, I know, and it's a reunion for so many of the players, that are in the Hall every year. They get to come back and such. Jeff Bagwell being enshrined along the players with Tim Raines and Ivan Rodriguez, and we were talking, because we're a Braves affiliate here, George Grande, about John Schuerholz being in the Hall of Fame as well, being inducted as an executive, as well as Bud Selig. It's a good class. And I want to ask you, The Bagwell, however, getting enshrined. I can recall Bill James saying he was the fourth greatest first baseman of all time. There were, however, some implications late in his career about PEDs. How has the PED scandal, in your opinion, changed the Hall of Fame at all? It's going to keep some players out for sure. How has that influenced the Hall of Fame, in your opinion?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, you followed the game, and I have too. And I think we all looked at how bodies changed in the '80s, and you wondered, might somebody be just lifting weights, or might they be taking some kind of supplements, or might they be taking something illegal? And who knows the answer to all those questions? I'm not smart enough to figure all this stuff out, but I do know that if I stood next to somebody and I saw an inordinate change in their body makeup, there had to be something more than just lifting weights. I mean, one of my favorite people in the game was Dale Murphy. And
sure.
I mean, he was big, burly, and strong, even as a kid when he was a catcher, and he made like 20-some-odd errors behind the plate. And I watched him come to the major leagues, and you looked at him, yeah, he was big and strong and burly, but you knew that was just his body. That's the way he was. Other guys you saw that were 170, 180 pounds, and all of a sudden they're 210 pounds. Something else has to be going on. But as a matter of fact, in talking about Murph, I did the Braves series recently, and when I went to Atlanta, just visiting with him, it was like seeing your long-lost brother. You talk about somebody who was special, somebody who was a wonderful person who played the game the right way. And in fact, I had a discussion with Joey Votto about Dale Murphy last year when Joey was struggling a little bit, and he turned his season around. And I said, there was no doubt in my mind that Dale Murphy was on his way to the Hall of Fame. And he had Bob Horner hitting behind him, and he had a pretty good lineup. Then all of a sudden, he was the only guy in the lineup. And Murph knew that if he didn't drive in a run, nobody else was going to drive in a run. So his strike zone went from being a very small strike zone to a gigantic strike zone where he was swinging at everything. So all of a sudden, a 300 hitter became a 250 hitter, and only because he was a great teammate, because he knew on those bad Braves teams that if he didn't get it done, nobody else was going to get it done. But in my mind, Dale Murphy's a Hall of Famer. He's the kind of a guy who, and speaking of another guy, Freddie McGriff, I think the way he conducted himself off the field as well as on the field, the numbers that he put up in retrospect, I think those are two guys who have been overlooked, but I think in my mind are Hall of Fame guys. But you look back at the '80s when so many of these guys, their bodies changed, and you mentioned Bagwell. Nothing ever had been linked to Bagwell conclusively. I know that he had a lot of injuries, shoulder injuries, hand injuries. In fact, when he retired, he could barely throw the baseball. And you talk about knee replacement. They told him with 3 or 4 years left in his career that he was going to need a shoulder replacement, which is a very difficult operation. But I know going into the Houston locker room, somebody asked me about 3 or 4 years ago, what's wrong with the Astros when they were rebuilding? I said 3 things: Biggio, Bagwell, Osmus. Those 3 guys ran that Houston clubhouse. They were lockered next to each other. They told the young players how to play the game. They showed them how to play the game the right way. And the example that they set for all the young players coming through in Houston, and for baseball players in general, certainly was exemplary. Biggio's in the Hall of Fame. Osmus, was a solid contributor, and Bagwell's in the Hall of Fame now. And I know I talked to Bags, and he's so excited. And the only guy who's more, there are only 2 guys that are more excited than Jeff Bagwell. One is Craig Biggio. They were like brothers. And the other was Matty Galante, who was the infield instructor that really, that first year at Kissimmee, Florida, when he was a third baseman. And you remember Caminiti was playing third, so there's no place for him. They moved him to first. And I'd be there at 6:30, 7 o'clock, and Matt Galante's nailing fungos at him down at first to give him a quick 3-week tutorial on how to be a first baseman, and he spent the rest of his career at first. So I'm happy for Galante, I'm happy for Biggio, and I'm certainly happy for Bagwell.
Well, Jeff Bagwell enshrined, along with Tim Raines, Ivan Rodriguez, Bud Selig, and John Schuerholz. We're talking to George Grande. He used to be the MC at the Baseball Hall of Fame. You probably know him now as a television broadcaster for the Cincinnati Reds, and a good one. In your answer, you talked a little bit for the Braves fans about Fred McGriff and Dale Murphy. I think Dale Murphy is a great oversight for the Hall of Fame. Do you think he's the biggest oversight, the guy who's not in, who should be in, or is there somebody else out there that you say, you know what, this is the George Grande, this guy should be in player? Who would that be?
I think there's a lot of them on that list. I remember, and every year I'd go up there. I mean, I did it for 30 years, and when I started, it was a mom-and-pop operation. And I remember talking with the Hall of Famers. This is when there was a 19-member Veterans Committee that used to get the Hall of Fame players who were not voted in by the writers, give them a second chance. And guys like Red Chandings got in that way, Bobby Dorr got in that way. And I sat there, and we would sit, and every year the guys that I would bring up, number one was Ron Santo. Number two is Tony Oliva, who in my mind certainly was one of the best hitters that I ever saw, and Bert Blyleven at that time. Now, Blyleven eventually got in. Gil Hodges was another one. And everybody, you talked to, Duke Snyder, and you talked to Roy Campanella, and they all swore that in their mind there was no doubt that Gil Hodges belonged in the Hall of Fame, not just as a player, but the way he performed as a manager. I mean, let's face it, Corey got in not because, he was an MVP player, but he got in because of what he did managerially speaking, and I think that certainly was true of Gil Hodges. And what you saw was, it's somewhat ironic, because every year the Hall of Famers, and almost to a man, everyone said, I don't know why Oliva's not in. Harmon Killebrew would argue for him every year, or I don't know why Hodges isn't in. And then they did away with the Veterans Committee, and now the Hall of Famers get the vote, and in most years, nobody got in. So, white men speak with forked tongue, always the old Tonto and Lone Ranger story, as Tonto used to say. And I think they talked a good game, but nobody voted for those guys. I was so happy that Ronnie Santo finally got in, but it's a shame because he got in a year after he passed away. And I know that, and Leo DeRocha, the same thing. Leo really ached to get into the Hall of Fame, and he gets in after he passes away. When you think of Ron Santo, not only did he play at an All-Star and Hall of Fame level, but he played at day baseball in Chicago at a time when he was a diabetic. He had to take insulin shots before the game. They didn't have pumps now where you could put it in your pocket and still play and do what you do on a daily basis. To play at the level that he played at, and then to have a career that he had as a broadcaster and a great ambassador to the game, it amazed me on how it took him so long to get in. But, I certainly think those guys at the top of a list, and I think I'm so happy for Timmy Raines because, other than Ricky Henderson, who was the greatest leadoff hitter of all time, Timmy was as impactful a player at the top of the lineup as any player that I've ever been around. I'm happy for him. We all know Pudge Rodriguez, how great he was defensively and offensively. And hey, let's be honest, there was some innuendo about Pudge back in those days too. A little guy that all of a sudden got big and wound up, being a great offensive player as well as a great defensive player. But I don't think there's any doubt that you can make a list of guys that have had great, outstanding careers. But there is an argument, and some old-time baseball people believe that there should be a special place for only the greatest, and there are a lot that are the greatest that are in there. But it was always great to be up there and be a part of not just their day, like it's Bagwell and Raines and Pudge and John Sherholtz, who in my mind I think is the greatest general manager in the history of the game. I was with John Sherholtz when he was in the Baltimore organization, and then when he went to Kansas City, he built that Kansas City story and operation ground floor up, including building the ballpark. And he did the same thing in Atlanta. And I don't think anybody has ever affected the game as a general manager. There's only one other guy that I can think of that was on a par with him, and that was Bob Howsam. So you put Bob Howsam on that list of executives who belong in the Hall of Fame because Bob Howsam did the same thing in Cincinnati, a small market team that nurtured the Big Red Machine and did things that no other general manager did for a small market team. But John Sherholtz was just remarkable, and I saw him at the winter meetings, and it was so good. We sat and reminisced about those early days and about the moments, the successful moments that he had, and some of the difficult moments as well. But it's good to see good things happen to good people. And in my mind, if you make a list of general managers, I think you'd put John Schuerholz at the very top of that list as a person and as a person that certainly constructed organizations that have passed the test of time.
We're talking to George Grande. He's a Reds broadcaster. He's been the MC of the Baseball Hall of Fame, the induction ceremonies this weekend in Cooperstown. You mentioned, so many players and so many people of great character. I know one of the criteria for the Hall of Fame actually is character. That's a voting and so it has, I think, traditionally been, if a sports writer didn't necessarily like a ball player, maybe they didn't vote for him. Or, flip side, maybe a beloved player was able to get in, say a Rabbit Moranaville from the old days, a Willie Stargell a little bit more contemporarily. Do you think character should be a criteria for the Hall of Fame?
Well, I certainly think it's a part of the evaluative process. But I'll tell you this, and I got an idea the direction you're going in, and you can go right to the top of the list, and that's Pete Rose.
Yeah,
who's banned from being elected or voted on, by Major League Baseball, so they can't even have a vote for him. And my belief is, I watched him play, and that nobody played the game harder than Pete Rose. Yes, he was banned from baseball because he bet on baseball, which was a cardinal sin, and the records that they lined up were all pertaining to what he did off the field and what he did as a manager. But as a guy who played on the field, nobody exhibited the greatness of the game of baseball better than a guy who couldn't run real well, couldn't hit the ball far, and was a decent defender, not a great one, but still wound up with more hits than anybody else in the history of the game. In my mind, I think you should be allowed to vote on him. I would put Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame just by the way he played the game as a player. But in addition to that, what a great teaching tool. Put him in and make the plaque tell the complete story. The warts, the negatives, as well as the positive, and it's also part of a teaching tool. And what is a museum? The Hall of Fame is the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and it should tell the entire story of baseball. But I don't think there's any doubt of all the players I covered in the game. Nobody played the game harder than Pete Rose. Nobody tried to win on the field more than Pete Rose. We live in a day and age. Every year, the last couple of years, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens votes have been going up. And I think in this day and age, it wouldn't surprise me in a few years if their numbers eventually get to the point where they will be close to possible election to the Hall of Fame, as some of the old-time Hall of Fame voters fall off, and the new younger voters who saw them play on a regular basis and liked the numbers that they put up might vote for them. So you telling me that if you've been linked to performance-enhancing drugs, that doesn't rise to the same way of evaluating of what Pete Rose, and Pete Rose was his own worst enemy. Let's be honest. I've said it to Pete, and Pete now admits it. He went 14 years without admitting that he bet on baseball. If he had, and this is a true story, I was very close to Bart Giamatti, who was the president of Yale. We grew up in Connecticut together, and I remember having breakfast with him at a little place when he was National League president, and he was going to take over for Peter Ueberroth, and I said, what are you going to do with Pete Rose? He said, I'll tell you, I'm going to offer him a 1-year suspension, and if he agrees to it, he'll be suspended for a year, and then he'll be back, and I'll reinstitute his legitimacy to the game of baseball. Pete, who's thought he was bulletproof, wouldn't agree to it. If he had agreed to that, he would have been voted on a year later. He would have been reinstated a year later, and he probably would have been in the Hall of Fame. But Pete was his own worst enemy, and I think he'll acknowledge that and admit it today. But nobody of the people I covered played the game harder than Pete Rose. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And how do you balance and how do you evaluate what Pete Rose did to what those that use performance-enhancing drugs did? I'm not smart enough to balance those two and decide who was worse. But it'll be amazing to me if at some point in time Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds are elected and Pete Rose is still banned. Somehow there's something not right about that.
Well, George Grande has a lot to say about baseball. You won't find anyone who's more enthusiastic. Hall of Fame weekend this weekend, and what a coup, what a great story there about Bart Giamatti and a proposed suspension to Pete Rose that would have allowed him to be in the Hall of Fame after all.